Welcome back. We started our journey through the Bible at creation, where we saw a picture of what God wanted life to look like. Then we saw all those things fall apart. And eventually, God called Abraham and promised Abraham unconditionally, I'm going to give you land, I'll give you descendants to fill that land, and all nations of the earth will be blessed through you. Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and he had 12 sons. They became the 12 tribes of Israel, and all those descendants ended up living in Egypt, and they kept having children, but they became enslaved in Egypt. They were being beaten, oppressed, even killed. And God finally sent Moses to deliver them from Egypt. And Moses brought them out of Egypt, and God provided for them in the desert, and he made a covenant with that nation, this brand new nation of Israel. If you do these things and you don't do these other things, you'll be blessed beyond anything you can imagine. But if you break this covenant, you'll end up being cursed and destroyed. And time went on, and they were not keeping the covenant well. They ended up enslaved by their enemies again, and they'd cry out to the Lord, and the Lord would raise up a judge to judge their enemies. And then they'd get comfortable and settle back into idolatry and worshiping other gods and doing all sorts of horrible things. And the cycle continued over and over until they said, we want a king. And God gave them the king they thought they wanted, King Saul. But King Saul didn't have the heart of a king. He was what the people asked for, but he just didn't have the heart of a king. So God chose a person he called a man after my own heart, and that was David. Saul soon enough discovered that David was the one that God anointed as king. So Saul is the acting king, he's on the throne, but David has been anointed as king. So he's known as the anointed one, or Messiah. So David then is in line to be king because God has anointed him, but Saul wants David dead so that he can keep the kingdom in his family line. So in the last session, we saw David about to be assassinated. He just barely escaped with his life, and he was able to sneak away. And he stopped at the house of the priest and said he wanted to protect the priest. If the priest knew that David was running from Saul, then the priest would be committing treason. David wanted to protect the priest, so he lied and told the priest, King Saul sent me on an urgent mission, and I was in such a hurry to leave that, silly me, I forgot my sword, I forgot to bring food. Do you have anything you could spare? And the priest gave David the consecrated bread from the tabernacle and the wine, and then gave David the sword of Goliath that was kept there in sort of like a treasury. And David said, this sword, I remember this, I cut off Goliath's head with this. And it was a great thing. So David took those things and left. And when he ran, he said to himself, where can I go that Saul won't follow me? Now Saul he's been fighting for most of his kingdom, really, with the Philistines. And the Philistines are getting stronger and stronger, and Saul's army is no match for the Philistine army. David said, I know where Saul won't chase me, into the Philistine cities. So David went to Gath, one of the main Philistine cities, and as he was approaching the city, here he is, David, with the sword of Goliath in his hand and some luggage carrying the food and things that the priest gave him. And he's approaching the city, and the guards on the city wall see somebody approaching, and of course they're on alert. So they grab their binoculars and they're looking, and as David gets closer, he starts watching them, and they're kind of pointing at him and whispering to each other. And they're saying to each other, isn't that David? Well, who lives in Gath that we've met before? Goliath. David killed Goliath, one of their main warriors. And here he is approaching the city with Goliath's sword in his hand. Well, he realizes quickly that's a bad idea, so he kind of inconspicuously hides the sword, behind a rock somewhere, and continues on. And as he gets closer, he gets within earshot of them. The archers are there, ready to draw arrows, and he overhears them talking, saying, "Get the king. This is David. How dare he approach our camp? And, what do you want us to do? Should we bring him to you? Should we kill him?" And David realizes he has just made a terrible mistake. It's too soon. He killed their key warrior. He's a threat to them. and they're going to kill him right now. As soon as the king, Abimelech, gives the word, he's going to get pierced with arrows all over his body. And what do? If he turns and runs, they're going to kill him. If he keeps going, they're most likely going to kill him. He thinks quick, comes up with a great plan. He pretends to be insane. He starts mumbling to himself. He lets drool run down his beard. He gets the most glazed look in his eyes that he can conjure, and he starts mumbling, "Saul trying to kill me. I'll show Saul for trying to kill me," and just carrying on, stumbling, starting to meander back and forth. At one point, the Bible says he made his mark on the wall, and it's kind of like marking your territory, like a dog would. He actually peed on the wall. Uh, and the guards on the wall are saying to Abimelech, "Well, what do we do here? Do you want me to bring him in?" And Abimelech says, "He's crazy. He's insane. I have enough crazy people in the city already. I don't need another one. Just get rid of him. Let him go." Well, the worldview at that time said basically, if you're insane, it's because you're demon possessed. And nobody really wants to be demon possessed. So if you kill an insane person, that demon no longer has a person to live in. So where does the demon go? Into the one who killed him. So all the archers are there saying, "Please don't make us kill David." Right? I don't want to be demon possessed. Nobody wants to do it. And David just kind of meanders his way back out of there and barely escapes with his life. Right? Very quick thinking on his part. David wrote 2 psalms about this, 2 songs. If you want to look them up, they're Psalm 34 and Psalm 56. Well worth reading. And they're praising God for saving him out of Abimelech's hand, which is really insightful as far as how God works. And we've mentioned this a little bit before. We'll see it again. But God, he has us do the work, and yet he's doing the work. It's not either or, right? It's not we do it or God does it. It's both and, right? David played insane, and that spared his life, but God was behind it all at the same time. So David credits God with that. Well, he finds a place to go. It's an area called Adullam, and there's a cave there. He escaped to the cave of Adullam. And I find this interesting. When his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. Everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was bitter in soul, gathered to him. He became commander over them. There were about 400 men there. And eventually we read about Jonathan going and visiting with David, and the 2 of them talk, and then Jonathan goes back home. Everybody can find David except for Saul. Saul's pursuing him, trying to kill him. Everybody else finds him right away, but nobody else. Saul can't. So think for a second, though, about these 400 men who start following David. Right? They hear David is running from Saul, and they go to him. Right? They find out where he is. They go to him. 400 men. Well, why? First of all, why would these men go to him? And it's because everybody knew what the prophet Samuel had said. Some believed it, some didn't. Some people said Samuel was just angry with Saul and just said it, but it wasn't really God. Other people said, no, this absolutely was God. Samuel was a prophet, and a great prophet. He wouldn't lie. Well, what Samuel said was, Saul, you're fired. God has removed you as king, and he's replacing you with a man after his heart. Well, who is that? And everybody's starting to realize it's David. And the people here want to follow David. They don't want to follow Saul. And think about the men following David now, right? We think of David very often as this great man of God, and he's called a man after God's heart. Right? And God calls him that. So, I mean, you really can't get too much better than that. But these men with him are not like your men's ministry at church. It's not a whole bunch of upright moral men who are following David because he's the king that God chose. They're following him. It specifically says here, everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him. Right? People who are in trouble with Saul, people who are in debt, people who can't get their lives together. It's people whose worlds are falling apart. um, people who are ready to rise up and go to war with Saul. Like, you have all these people, bitter people, angry people, and they go to David, right? This is where David really learns to be king. And he does it with these men following him. Later on, there are 600 men following him. The number starts to grow. Well, David is a natural warrior, and he starts training these men. He becomes sort of like he's not king, but he becomes sort of like their acting king, I guess. He's the leader of this band of men. Many of these men have families that are with them. And Saul, meanwhile, is still trying to kill David. He ends up just leaning into his men, saying, I can't trust any of you. You know, my own son is conspiring against me to make David king, and none of you told me. And he's really laying into them, being hard on them, and blaming them for all his troubles. And this guy Doeg shows up. He goes to Saul and tells him, Ahimelech, the priest, betrayed you. He supported David. He gave David a sword. He armed your enemy, and he gave David food, sustenance. And, what are you going to do about it now? Well, Saul decides to kill Ahimelech the priest and all his children. He's basically killing off the priesthood here. He commands his soldiers to go do this, to go kill the priests. The soldiers say to Saul, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to kill the priests. And Saul, just again, if a king gives you orders to do something, you do it. Otherwise, there are some severe consequences for you. Saul just kind of says, all right, fine, who's going to do it? Doeg, you do it. And Doeg then goes off and actually he carries it out. He kills all these priests. Well, one escaped, and he went to David. He found David and told David what happened. And David said, I knew it. In my heart, I knew it. Doeg was there. He's an Edomite. I should never have trusted that he would not betray me, or he was going to accuse me. He was going to use this opportunity for his gain, and I should have known. So he says to this person, I can't possibly make this up to you, but stay with me, right? Do not be afraid. He who seeks my life seeks your life. With me, you will be safe. I will keep you safe. And he stays with David. The number of people following David is growing. And here we see a big difference between Saul and David, right? Like we just saw King Saul. The people, he told the people, go kill the priests. And the people, his soldiers, said, no, we're not doing it. And Saul said, fine, I'll find somebody else to do it. We saw earlier, Saul disobeyed Samuel's orders because he was afraid of the people. He was afraid of his soldiers. Well, here, David finds out the Philistines are fighting a city called Keilah. So David prayed to the Lord, said, shall I go and attack the Philistines at Keilah? And the Lord said, go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. So David told his men, get ready for battle. We're going to Keilah to fight the Philistines. And the men say, we're going to do what? We're scared enough just hiding here from Saul. How are we going to go fight the Philistines? Even Saul has a bigger army than this, and they slaughter him. This makes no sense, David. We can't do that. We're not doing that. So David, right, now when the people said this to King Saul, Saul backed down. David instead went back to the Lord and said, basically, Lord, I need to know for sure that this is from you. I need confirmation that you are going to keep us safe and deliver the city of Keilah, deliver those Philistines into our hands. And the Lord answered and said, arise, go to Keilah. I will give the Philistines into your hand. So David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines, and they won. They brought away spoil from the battle, and that was it. The people said to David, we can't do this. We're terrified. Please, don't make us do this. David went back to the Lord. He listened to his men. He heard his men. Went back to the Lord, and the Lord said, yes, do it. I have your back. And David said, men, we're going. Deal with it. Get your swords and come on. And they did. They followed David. David is that kind of a leader. He has the heart that you need to be a king. The city of Keilah, however, the people in that city ended up turning him over. They sent a message to Saul. They betrayed David after David saved them, and they sent a message to Saul saying, David's here. So David had to run again. David, around this time, wrote Psalm 63, and if you're following along in the Psalms, Psalm 52, David wrote that psalm when he found out about the priests all being killed. And I'm going to flip over to Psalm 52 and just get a little glimpse of it. To the choir master, a maskil of David, when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul, David has come to the house of Ahimelech. Why do you boast of evil, O mighty man? The steadfast love of God endures all the day. Your tongue plots destruction. You are like a sharp razor, you worker of deceit. You love evil more than good, and lying more than what is right. You love all words that devour, O deceitful tongue. But God will break you down forever. He will snatch and tear you from your tent. He will uproot you from the land of the living. Some of these verses have the word Selah after them, and that basically means pause and think about what you've just read or what you've just said or heard. And he goes on talking about the destruction of the evil and the goodness of God and his own trust in God. But you can hopefully see David is really pouring out what's really on his mind here. It's not just some beautiful prayer to butter God up or something like that. He's really saying, evil one, specifically Saul, the enemies of the priest, possibly Doeg, you're going to be destroyed. And I would bet it's kind of a happy tune. Not some really dark, sinister sound, but a happy tune. I'm happy about this. You're going to be ripped up to shreds. So Psalm 63 is when the city of Keilah betrayed David. Well, David kept running. He went to the wilderness of Ziph, and Jonathan, other people were still able to go find David there without too much problem, and Saul couldn't find him. Eventually, Saul did find out. He heard word about where David was, and he went to pursue David, but he had to return. David escaped again. So David went and lived in En-Gedi. En-Gedi is up in, there are some mountains overlooking the Mediterranean, and it's a really beautiful place. I was in Israel twice. My second trip to Israel, I got to see En-Gedi. We didn't get to go deep into it like you can on some tours. There was a huge storm the night before, and the park wasn't even opened. But our tour guide kind of knew everybody in all Israel and somehow managed to get us in. So we got to go to the lower part of it, kind of like the entranceway to En-Gedi. And you can see there are waterfalls. This is the first of the waterfalls that you encounter along these trails. And I hear they get more beautiful as you go up. But you can see there's fresh running water. There are animals living in this whole region here. So there's meat, there's fresh water, and there are caves all throughout. And you can see in some of the photos the holes there. They're actual caves, and you can go in, and it's like hollowed out. So I don't think you can go in on any tour or anything. I don't think, but David and his men would have been going through all these trails of caves. And it's great because you can go hide in the caves if you need to. If you go in one way, you can come out another way and not get cornered or trapped in there. You have, like we said, water and meat, and it's a perfect place for David to hide. And when you go outside, you're overlooking the Mediterranean. I mean, it's beautiful. So if I'm ever running for my life and I have to, just drop everything and go and live out in the wilderness, I wouldn't mind living in a place like that. It's really pretty ideal. So there David is, living in the caves with his men. And King Saul found out where David was. So Saul went to En-Gedi, and he had a 3,000 person army. The armies all lined up there. They're in one of the valleys outside of these mountains, and they're getting ready for battle. They know David is in there. They just got to figure out where. I'm sure they'll send some scouts in to report back, and then they'll attack. And the men are waiting, and I've been told from a Bible teacher I listened to who's a Marine, retired now, but he was in the Marines, and he said when you're going into battle, said it's always a good idea to use the bathroom first, because you don't want to be out on the battlefield with bullets flying and then have to do number two. So Saul here goes into the cave and finds a nice quiet place and opens up his newspaper, sits down, and he's doing his thing. And one of David's men happened to be right nearby there, and he smells something. He said, what is that? And he peers around the corner, and who's there? King Saul. With his back to him, had no idea that the guy was there. And he snuck as quick and quietly as he could over to David and said, David, grab your sword. You've got to see this. The Lord has given your enemy into your hands. And so he brought David back to Saul. And David snuck up behind Saul. And now his garment was down, right? Because he's doing his thing. And David had, the garment was within reach. So David got his dagger and cut some of the tassels off his garment. So the garments they were rounded, right? But if you think of corners, like you reach down with your hands in the front and the back, the Jewish people, what they would wear, they would have tassels on their garments. And the little ropey things coming down, little pieces of yarn or whatever it was made of, and they would tie these tassels into 613 knots among the four corners there. Well, David took the corner of Saul's garment and cut it off, and then snuck back into the cave. And his buddy there said, "What are you doing? You could kill him. You could end this whole thing. We could stop running." And David said, "No, I don't dare lay a finger on the Lord's anointed." Right? David still, even though David was now anointed by God to be king, Saul was still on the throne, and David respected that position. And David is an extremely smart politician. If he assassinates Saul, then people will accuse him of killing Saul to get the throne himself, and people who don't support him are going to have a field day trying to undo David's kingdom. It'll be a mess for him. So on both counts here, David is very wise. Well, Saul finishes up, and he leaves the cave. David follows him out from a distance. And as Saul gets halfway back to his men, David leaves the cave and yells out, "King Saul, my father." Right? Saul turns around and recognizes David, and David holds up the corner of Saul's garment and says, my master, my king, I could have just killed you, and I didn't. Right? And here's proof. And Saul looks down at his garment, and there it is, the corner missing. And he pieces together, wow, David really actually could have just killed me. And he didn't. Why not? And David said, "I'm not a threat to you. I mean you no harm. All I want to do is just be left alone. Just, why do you chase me? I'm like a flea. I'm a flea on a dog. Like, what? Why do you keep chasing me like this?" And Saul, in this moment of clarity, comes to his senses and says, "David, my son, you are right. And I should not be chasing you like this. You obviously are not trying to harm me in any way. And, I have to concede, it looks like you really will be the next king." Well, his 3,000-man army is standing right there listening to this conversation, and they're all whispering to each other, "Now wait, what did he just say? Which king should we be following here?" And they've already lost some faith they had in Saul, but now even more so. Saul himself is saying David will be king. And if you're in this army, you got to be asking some questions right now. Well, they leave, and things are looking good, right? David and his men, they went to, Samuel died. People buried Samuel at his house in Ramah. Then David and his men went to Paran. They're living in the wilderness, this time in a place called Paran. And it was customary in this time period, right? Two things would happen. One, imagine you have a pretty big size household. You have some shepherds, you have a lot of sheep, you have flocks, you have crops, whatever you have. And things are going pretty well. But you have these hired hands, right? You hire a shepherd, you hire somebody to work the fields, and groups of armed men who just wandered from place to place, think like gangs, they would show up fully armed to the shepherd and say, "Give us 10 of your sheep." Now, if you're a hired hand, you're making minimum wage watching these sheep, and people, pull a bunch of, four guys with pistols, point them at your head and say, "Give us some of these sheep," you're going to give them the sheep, right? What are you, why lose your life for minimum wage, right? Why, they're not mine, they're his, whatever, take them. So what would happen is other groups of people, such as David and his men, would live in the region and just kind of wander from place to place, and they were like serving like bodyguards. Nobody would hire them. Nobody would actually hire David and his men to do this, but it was another way to kind of make a living. It's almost like if you're a waiter or a waitress, most people who are waiters and waitresses make most of their money on tips. And even if you get bad service, tip them, because that's their living, right? They make much less than minimum wage. They really thrive on tips. So you're not legally required to leave a tip, but you kind of have to, right? Even though it's not a law thing, you do kind of have to do it. You could leave a better tip or not so good tip, depending, but you leave a tip. So it's very rare that anybody would walk out without leaving a tip, but you really have to have exceptionally bad service. So that was just the way of life here. David and his men were among these groups that would go and serve as like bodyguards for a certain region. So nobody hired you, but it's just cultural expectation, common knowledge, that at the end of the season, when you pull in your crops, you give some of the crops to these people for protecting you. You don't have to, but if you don't, it's bad. It looks really bad for you. You just kind of don't do that. Well, David and his men were doing this. And the end of the season came, people are pulling in their crops, and he would send a messenger to one of the families that he was protecting, saying, "Hey, is there anything you can spare? We've been protecting you. We haven't taken anything from you. We made sure that you're safe. If there's anything you can spare, please do so." And they would send some, couple sheep and some crops and whatever. Well, David goes to this other guy's house. His name was Nabal. And the name Nabal means fool. So we already know something's up here. So he sent a messenger to the house of Nabal, and he was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. That is very wealthy. His wife's name was Abigail. She was discerning and beautiful, is the way that the Bible describes her. But Nabal, or fool, this man was harsh and badly behaved. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So he sent some messengers. David said, "Go up to Carmel, go to Nabal, greet him in my name, and thus you shall greet him. Peace to you," or shalom, "and peace to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you are shearers. Your shepherds have been with us. We did them no harm. They missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel." Right? Nobody took anything from them. We didn't take anything from them. We made sure of it. "And therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." Right? Very typical greeting, typical request for, it's kind of like leaving the tip at dinner, right? That same idea. So David's men showed up. They said all this to Nabal, and then they waited for the reply. And Nabal answered David's servant, saying, "Who is David? Who is this son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I don't know where?" So David's men came back and told David all this. And David said, "Men, grab your swords." David grabbed his sword. About 400 men went up after David. 200 remained with the baggage. Right by now, David has about 600 men following him. And something's up here, right? If you don't leave a tip at dinner, you kind of have to. If you don't, it's pretty bad. But people don't chase you out of the restaurant with knives, gathering an army to come slaughter you and your family. right? David's ready to go kill every man living in this household. And something is up. Well, his wife Abigail, Nabal's wife Abigail, finds out what happened, and she panics. She knows David is offended by this. Well, we have to start asking, how does she know that David is going to react like this? Right? Well, the messengers tell Abigail. Abigail panicked. She took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine, right? Anything she could find that was already prepared, threw it in as many bags as she could carry, and she started running out to meet David, commanded some of the servants to make more food so that it would be ready when David got there. And Abigail, this beautiful woman, the wife of Nabal, runs out toward David. Well, David is on his horse with his men. They're charging, right? And out comes this beautiful woman running right up to David. Well, that certainly gets David's attention. So he stops, and he's willing to hear what she has to say. And she bows down to him. And what she says gives us a huge clue about what's actually happening here. Abigail saw David. She got down from the donkey she was on, fell before David on her face, bowed down to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "On me alone, my lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Do not let my lord regard this worthless fellow, Nabal, for as his name is, so is he." His name means fool. And she says, as his name, he is, right? No, fool is just like his name. Folly is with him. I, your servant, did not see the young men of my lord, and it's completely my fault. Had I only seen them, I would have done things very differently. I would have handled it, right? Now then, my lord, as the Lord Yahweh lives, and as your soul lives, because Yahweh has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving, which it means avenging yourselves. The Hebrew word means avenging yourselves. The Lord has kept you from avenging yourselves and with your own hand. So let your enemies and those who seek to do evil be to you, David, as Nabal. In other words, may your enemies end up facing the horrors that Nabal will face. Let Nabal be punished, but don't shed this innocent blood. Don't avenge yourself by your own hands. Right? Well, why not? She says, I've brought some food. I have other people making more for you. Please forgive my trespasses against you. For Yahweh will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord David is fighting the battles of Yahweh, and evil shall not be found in you as long as you live. Right, so here she's starting to get at what really is going on behind the scenes. Yahweh will make you, David, a house. Well, what did God say? He said, I've chosen a man after my heart to become king. And everybody knows that. And Abigail here is alluding to that. If men rise up to pursue you and seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living, in the care of Yahweh your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out, like the hollow of a sling. Well, why would she say a sling, not a sword? Because David, his reputation came from that very first battle where he used a sling to kill Goliath. It's a reference to David as a warrior. Another subtle hint that she's referring to David as the king that God has chosen. And when the Lord has done to my Lord, you, David, according to all the good he has spoken concerning you, well, what good is that? The Lord anointed him as king. Right? So when he has done all that and has appointed you prince over Israel, and here she's not making hints anymore. When the Lord has appointed you prince over Israel, you are king, you are taking the throne. My Lord shall have no cause for grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause. For my Lord working salvation himself, or avenging himself. When Yahweh has dealt with my Lord, remember your servant. All right, so the gist of what she says is, First of all, it's completely my fault. Please don't blame Nabal. Nabal's name means fool, and he is a fool. If only I had seen the servants. I should have seen them. I should have reacted, but it's my fault. Please forgive me. I have food. I'll give you everything you need, but please don't make this mistake. If you go and avenge yourself now by your own hands, then the Lord will still make you king, but when you become king, you're going to have this blood on your hands, and it's going to make your kingdom much more difficult. People will be able to look at you and point fingers and say, this man remember that thing with Nabal where he went and killed everybody, right? That's not a man of God, and he's going to have this against him. So please forgive me. Please relent in your wrath. Don't take matters into your own hands. Let the Lord deal with it, so that when you're king, you have a clean conscience and you have nothing on your record that anybody can accuse you of. And David responds saying, blessed be Yahweh, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. And he goes on to say, I will relent. You have just saved me from making a huge mistake. You've talked sense into me. Thank you. So David and his men turned around. They accepted the gifts that Abigail brought. They turned around and went back to their camp. Well, meanwhile, Abigail went home and she went to see Nabal. He was having a feast in his house. He was pretty drunk, and it sounds like he was sort of a nasty drunk, because she said nothing until it was morning. But there Nabal is. The wine had gone out of Nabal. Now he's just left with a bit of a hangover. And then Abigail told him all the things that happened. And Nabal's heart died within him, and he became as a stone. And about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. So David hears about this. He receives word that guy Nabal, remember that jerk? Well, he died. He's dead now. And David said, oh, that's awesome, that jerk. And, oh, that means Abigail is not married. He sends for Abigail and proposes to her, please marry me. And Abigail says, yeah. So you just let me grab my bag. And she's out the door. So David marries Abigail. David already had wives, but Abigail became another wife now. And then we get the little note, mentioned this already, but Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to another guy to be this other guy's wife. So Saul just said, oh, well, if David really, you're either lying to me or David really did threaten you. Either way, you're not his wife anymore. He's not your husband anymore. You're marrying this other. Well, David has another opportunity to end the conflict with King Saul. And we'll find out what happens there in the next session.